Hey guys, tonight we're talking about revenge, medieval revenge, specifically, the kind that didn't involve deep breaths, forgiveness, or being the bigger person. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Robert the Bruce did not begin his revenge story as a powerful king standing confidently on a battlefield. He began it as a man hiding in caves, sleeping badly, losing friends at an alarming rate, and slowly realizing that medieval politics was less about honor and more about who stabbed you last. He was betrayed, publicly, thoroughly. His claim to the Scottish throne collapsed so fast it barely had time to embarrass itself. Allies vanished. Supporters were executed. At one point, Robert was reduced to running for his life, which is not usually how kings imagine their career trajectory. Most people at this stage would have panicked, surrendered, or written a very sad medieval poem. Robert did none of those things. Instead, he waited, and not in a dramatic, sword-clenching way. He waited in the deeply inconvenient sense, hiding, watching, remembering names, and mentally filing away grudges like an extremely patient accountant. This waiting was not heroic. It was uncomfortable. He slept in the cold, trusted almost no one, and had enough time alone to replay every bad decision he had ever made. But that time also taught him something important. Medieval power was fragile. Men who seemed loyal today would abandon you tomorrow if the wind changed direction. Kingship, he learned, was mostly about timing and not dying long enough for circumstances to improve. Years passed. His enemies relaxed. They assumed he was finished. Medieval society loved nothing more than a fallen man who stayed fallen. Robert, inconveniently, refused to cooperate with that expectation. When he returned, he did not announce revenge. He simply started winning, quietly, one fortress at a time, one alliance at a time, no speeches, no dramatic gestures, just steady progress that made his enemies increasingly uncomfortable. Then came Bannockburn. On paper, Robert should have lost badly. The English army was larger, better equipped, and very confident. Unfortunately for them, confidence is not armor. Robert used terrain, preparation, and a memory sharpened by years of humiliation. The victory shattered English control in Scotland and crowned him king. His revenge was not loud, it was not theatrical, it was administrative. The men who mocked him lived long enough to see him succeed, and in medieval terms, that was far worse than dying quickly. Robert the Bruce didn't rush revenge. He let it mature, like a fine medieval grievance. Matilda of Tuscany did not take revenge with swords, poison, or dramatic battlefield speeches. She chose a far more devastating strategy. She simply refused to die. In medieval Europe, this was an aggressive move. Matilda was one of the most powerful women of her time, which immediately meant most emperors, popes, and rival nobles spent decades trying to sideline her, ignore her, marry her off, or quietly wait for her to disappear from history like so many inconvenient women before her. They assumed time would solve the problem. Time, however, was not on their side. She was insulted, undermined, and openly challenged by men who believed power belonged to them by default. Some tried to take her lands. Others questioned her authority. A few assumed she was merely holding power temporarily, until a proper ruler arrived. Matilda listened politely. Then she waited. And she waited a long time. While emperors declared her irrelevant, she governed. While rivals plotted, she formed alliances. While enemies aged, fell ill, or died dramatically of medieval causes like bad water or too much ambition, Matilda stayed exactly where she was, running things, quietly, competently, annoyingly. Her revenge was subtle but brutal. She watched her enemies exhaust themselves. She watched political tides shift. She watched successors inherit grudges without inheriting the competence required to act on them. One by one, the The men who tried to control her vanished from the board, some through death, others through irrelevance, which in medieval society was arguably worse. There was no final confrontation, no climactic battle, just an uncomfortable realization spreading across Europe that Matilda was still there, still powerful, still very much in charge. At some point, even her enemies stopped fighting her and started negotiating with her instead, the medieval equivalent of admitting defeat without apologizing. This kind of revenge drove people insane. You couldn't fight it. You couldn't outlaw it. You couldn't even complain without admitting failure. Matilda became a constant reminder that patience, survival, and administrative competence could defeat brute force. She didn't destroy her enemies. She outlasted them. And in medieval politics, that was the coldest revenge of all. William Wallace's revenge story is unusual, because it did not end when he did. In fact, his enemies would probably argue that it became significantly worse afterward. Wallace did not start as a grand noble with armies and titles. He started as a man who had watched his family murdered, his homeland humiliated, and English officials behave as if Scotland were an inconvenient detail. His response was not subtle. He didn't write letters. He didn't negotiate. He chose violence immediately and enthusiastically. Wallace attacked symbols of English authority wherever he could find them. Sheriffs, garrisons, tax collectors. If it represented control, it became a target. His victories were loud, embarrassing, and deeply irritating to England. This was not revenge delivered with elegance. This was revenge delivered with a large sword and very little patience. Eventually, of course, medieval reality caught up with him. Wallace was betrayed, captured, and executed in a public spectacle designed to erase him completely. England assumed that would be the end of the problem. Medieval governments loved that assumption. It was wrong. Instead of killing the rebellion, Wallace's execution transformed him into something far more dangerous, a symbol. His death did not frighten Scotland into submission. It irritated them, deeply. His story spread, exaggerated, polished, and repeated until it became impossible to ignore. Wallace, inconveniently, became immortal. Every rebellion that followed carried his name like a banner. His enemies didn't just have to deal with armies, they had to deal with memory. And memory, unlike a man, cannot be executed, quartered, or displayed on city gates. The irony is brutal. Wallace never lived to see Scotland free. He never enjoyed comfort, safety, or victory in the long term. But his revenge worked anyway. His enemies spent decades fighting a ghost they had created themselves. Every time Scotland resisted, Wallace's shadow appeared again, quietly reminding England that killing the man had solved absolutely nothing. Medieval revenge often relied on fear. Wallace's revenge relied on persistence. He did not destroy England's control personally. He made it impossible for them to ever feel secure again. In the medieval world, that kind of revenge was devastating. William Wallace did not win by surviving. He won by refusing to disappear. And that is the kind of revenge that keeps rulers awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering which mistakes history will refuse to forgive. Eleanor of Aquitaine did not take revenge quickly. That would have been uncivilized. Instead, she chose something far more effective: patience, memory, and a very long marriage. Eleanor was one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, which unfortunately meant she married a man who absolutely could not handle that fact. King Henry, her husband, eventually decided that Eleanor's political influence, intelligence, and tendency to think independently were deeply inconvenient. His solution was not counselling, it was imprisonment. For years, Eleanor was confined, not in a dungeon, but in a comfortable, humiliating sort of captivity designed to keep her quiet and irrelevant. Henry assumed that time would soften her, that isolation would erase her influence, and that eventually she would fade into the background like an old tapestry no one remembered to dust. Henry misunderstood Eleanor completely. While confined, Eleanor did not forget. She observed. She remembered every insult, every restriction, Every moment she was treated as a problem rather than a partner. She also outlived Henry, which immediately improved her circumstances. The moment Henry died, Eleanor stepped out of captivity and back into power as if she had merely been waiting for a meeting to end. And then she began dismantling everything her husband had built to sideline her. She arranged alliances, she ruled territories, she guided the reigns of her sons, she travelled across Europe issuing commands while the memory of her confinement quietly followed her everywhere. Her revenge was elegant. She did not publicly condemn Henry. She did not erase his legacy outright. She did something far more painful. She made herself indispensable. While Henry was remembered largely for his failures, Eleanor became the enduring force behind multiple reigns, multiple kingdoms, and an entire generation of European politics. The man who tried to silence her became a historical footnote in her story. Eleanor's revenge was not about anger. It was about correction. She simply ensured that history remembered who truly held power. In medieval society, memory was everything, and Eleanor controlled hers. This was not revenge with blood. This was revenge with legacy. She proved a dangerous truth that medieval men learned far too late. If you lock a woman like Eleanor away, she does not disappear. She waits. And when she returns, she does not raise her voice. She raises the standard and rewrites the narrative. Vlad the Impaler believed in revenge the way some people believe in interior design, with a theme, a message, and absolutely no subtlety whatsoever. As a child, Vlad was taken hostage, humiliated, and forced to watch his family's power collapse, while foreign rulers treated his homeland like a welcome mat. This was not a character-building experience. This was a character-sharpening experience. Vlad learned early that mercy was optional, and fear was far more reliable. When he finally returned to power, Vlad did not rush. He invited his enemies to dinner. This was a mistake on their part. Vlad had a deep appreciation for symbolism. He understood that killing your enemies quietly was inefficient. Killing them publicly, creatively, and in large numbers, however, sent a message that tended to stick. His chosen method of execution was impalement, not because it was fast, humane, or popular, but because it was unforgettable. When rivals betrayed him, he didn't chase them down immediately. He let them feel safe first. He let them attend banquets, smile, drink wine, and enjoy the illusion of normalcy. Then he introduced consequences. Entire groups of nobles were executed in ways designed to be seen from miles away. Forests of impaled bodies became warnings, carefully arranged to discourage further disobedience. This wasn't madness. This was policy. Invading armies approaching Vlad's territory reportedly stopped, stared, and reconsidered their life choices. Soldiers who expected resistance instead found psychological warfare on an industrial scale. The message was clear. You could fight Vlad, but you would not enjoy the experience. His revenge was not personal in the modern sense. It was strategic. Vlad wanted to make betrayal feel expensive. Painfully expensive. Ideally expensive enough that people would choose literally any other option. Did this make him popular? No. Did it make him effective? Unfortunately, yes. Enemies remembered him long after he was gone. His name became shorthand for terror, punishment, and consequences delivered with theatrical flair. Even centuries later, his reputation still does most of the work for him. Vlad did not forgive. He did not forget. He advertised. In medieval Europe, revenge often restored honor. Vlad went further. He weaponized it, and while history debates his sanity, it cannot debate his results. Sometimes revenge isn't about balance. Sometimes it's about making sure no one ever tries again. Some medieval revenge stories are deeply personal. The Sicilian Vespers was not one of them. This was revenge as a community effort, organized, synchronized, and carried out by people who had finally decided they were done being polite. For years, Sicily lived under foreign rule that treated the island less like a kingdom and more like a badly managed occupation zone. Taxes were heavy, local customs were ignored, and foreign soldiers behaved like they owned the place, because technically they did. This arrangement was deeply unpopular, which in medieval terms meant everyone smiled in public and seethed privately. The breaking point came during an evening church service. A single incident, humiliating, public, and very poorly timed, ignited something that had been building for years. The bells rang for evening prayers, and instead of spiritual reflection, the population collectively decided it was time to settle accounts. What followed was not chaos. That's the unsettling part. It was coordinated. Locals identified their targets carefully. Foreign soldiers and officials were attacked while neighbours protected neighbours. Passwords were used to identify outsiders. If you failed the test, you failed permanently. This was revenge with logistics. By the time the violence ended, thousands were dead. Entire ruling structures collapsed in a matter of days. The occupiers had assumed their power was secure. They had mistaken silence for acceptance. A classic medieval error. The most uncomfortable part for historians is how efficient it all was. There was no single leader, no dramatic speech, no villain monologue, just a shared understanding that the time for restraint had expired. Revenge didn't roar. It moved quickly, quietly, and decisively. Foreign powers were shocked. They always are. They asked how such a thing could happen so suddenly. The answer, as always, was simple. It wasn't sudden at all. It was patient. The Sicilian Vespers became legendary not because of its brutality, medieval Europe was full of that, but because of its unity. Revenge wasn't delivered by a king or an army. It was delivered by shopkeepers, farmers, priests and neighbours who had reached the same conclusion independently. This was not revenge driven by anger alone. It was revenge driven by exhaustion. And that may be the most dangerous kind of all. Because when an entire population agrees that revenge is necessary, there is no negotiating, no appealing to mercy, and no pretending things will calm down soon. They already waited long enough. King John of England had a remarkable talent for turning allies into enemies. Not through dramatic betrayal or fiery speeches, but through something far more effective. Relentless incompetence mixed with casual cruelty. He taxed heavily, broke promises enthusiastically, and treated his nobles like disposable furniture. Eventually, the nobles decided they had had enough furniture. This was not a sudden rebellion. It was a slow burn. The English barons watched John lose wars, squander resources, and humiliate the crown repeatedly. They complained. He ignored them. They warned him. He mocked them. Medieval rulers often forgot one crucial detail. Angry nobles were not peasants. They had money, castles, and a worrying number of swords. When the barons finally acted, they didn't storm the palace screaming revenge. That would have been messy. Instead, they cornered John and forced him to sign a document that humiliated him permanently. The Magna Carta was not a peace agreement. It was revenge disguised as legality. Every clause was a reminder of John's failures. It limited his power, restrained his authority, and ensured that future kings would remember exactly what happened when they pushed their nobles too far. It was the medieval equivalent of being forced to publicly acknowledge you were wrong, in writing, forever. John, naturally, hated it. He tried to undo it immediately, appealing to the Pope and declaring the Charter invalid. This only made him look weaker, which was impressive considering his previous performance. The barons, meanwhile, had achieved something far more lasting than execution. They had broken the myth of absolute kingship. This was revenge without bloodshed. No executions, no sieges. Just a king forced to admit, on parchment, that he could not be trusted to rule unchecked. In medieval politics, that was devastating. John died not long after, miserable and angry. The document survived him. Every time future kings encountered limits on their power, John's failure echoed quietly in the background. The barons didn't destroy him physically, they dismantled his authority. And in a world where power was everything, that was the cleanest revenge imaginable. King John lost battles. He lost respect. And finally, he lost the illusion that he ruled by divine right alone. all because a group of nobles decided revenge didn't need swords, just ink. Isabella of France did not scream, threaten, or dramatically flip tables when her husband sidelined and humiliated her. That would have been undignified. Instead, she did something far more dangerous in medieval politics. She paid attention. Married to King Edward, Isabella found herself ignored, publicly disrespected, and replaced in influence by favourites who seemed to appear at court purely to test her patience. Edward assumed his wife would tolerate this arrangement indefinitely. After all, medieval queens were expected to smile politely and accept whatever nonsense was happening around them. Isabella accepted nothing. She waited. She watched alliances form and collapse. She learned who disliked the king, who felt insulted, and who was simply waiting for permission to act. She travelled abroad under the reasonable excuse of diplomacy and returned with something far more useful than goodwill: support. When Isabella finally moved, it was not loud. There were no fiery speeches about betrayal. She returned with an army, landed in England, and discovered that almost no one was willing to defend the king. This is always an awkward moment for a ruler. Edward was captured, deposed, and removed from power with shocking efficiency. Isabella did not need to personally raise a sword. The system collapsed around him naturally, like a poorly built scaffold. His reign ended not with a dramatic battle, but with quiet confinement and a deeply suspicious death that historians continue to discuss carefully. This was revenge executed with paperwork, timing, and an excellent understanding of human weakness. Isabella did not destroy the kingdom. She did not burn cities. She simply removed the man who had made her irrelevant and replaced him with someone more cooperative. In medieval terms, this was an outstanding outcome. Her revenge was subtle enough that some chroniclers barely recognized it as revenge at all. They described it as political necessity, stability, or correction. Isabella presumably did not correct them. The lesson here is uncomfortable but clear. Medieval revenge did not always involve blood. Sometimes it involved patience, alliances, and letting your enemy remain convinced they were safe right up until they were not. Isabella of France did not shout. She did not rush. She did not forgive. She waited until removing a king felt less like rebellion and more like housekeeping. And that, in medieval Europe, was the most elegant revenge imaginable. Jan Hus did not live to enjoy his revenge, which in medieval history is surprisingly common and deeply inconvenient for the people who thought killing him would solve everything. Hus was a reformer, a preacher, and, most importantly, a man who would not stop talking about corruption in the church. This alone made him dangerous. When he was summoned to a council under a promise of safe conduct, he did what any reasonable medieval intellectual would do. He trusted it. This was a mistake. Hus was arrested, tried, and executed anyway, burned publicly in a very dramatic attempt to prove that authority had won. The message was clear: speak out, and this is what happens. The authorities assumed fear would do the rest. It did not. Instead of silencing dissent, Hus's execution irritated an entire region. His followers did not react immediately. They didn't riot wildly and burn everything down overnight. That would have been too easy to suppress. Instead, they organized. They armed themselves. They remembered. What followed were the Hussite Wars, a series of rebellions so persistent that even professional armies struggled to contain them. Peasant soldiers, armed with wagons, farm tools, and unearned confidence, repeatedly defeated forces that were supposed to crush them. Every victory carried the same unspoken message. Killing Hus had made things worse. This is the cruel irony of medieval revenge. Executing a man might remove a voice, but it can also create a symbol. Symbols are extremely difficult to execute. Hus's enemies spent years fighting not just soldiers but ideas that had already proven immune to fire. Each attempt to stamp out the movement only confirmed Hus's warnings about corruption and abuse of power. His death became evidence, not deterrence. In the end, concessions were made. Reforms were negotiated. Authority adjusted itself quietly, pretending this was always part of the plan. Hus, meanwhile, remained dead, but victorious in the only way medieval history allows, by forcing his enemies to change. His revenge was delayed, indirect, and unstoppable. He never raised a sword. He never saw the outcome. And yet his enemies paid for his execution many times over. Jan Hus did not defeat his opponents in life. He defeated them by refusing to be forgotten. In medieval Europe, memory was power, and Hus weaponized it perfectly, even from the grave. If medieval Europe had offered awards for internal family destruction, the Angevin dynasty would have won every category, and still complained the judging was unfair. This was a family that treated revenge not as an emotional reaction, but as a deeply respected inheritance passed down from parent to child, like land or titles. The Angevin household was not a place of warmth. It was a place of ambition, suspicion, and an unspoken understanding that today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy, especially if they shared your last name. Fathers distrusted sons. Sons plotted against fathers. Brothers competed with the enthusiasm of people who knew only one of them would still be alive or relevant at the end. King Henry, the family patriarch, discovered early that raising powerful sons was a terrible idea. Each son felt entitled to rule immediately, preferably without waiting for inconvenient details like their father's death. Henry responded by dividing lands, making promises, and breaking them repeatedly, a strategy that somehow made everything worse. The sons revolted, constantly. They allied with enemies, raised armies, and betrayed one another with impressive speed. Family dinners must have been deeply uncomfortable, assuming they happened at all. Medieval chroniclers stopped pretending this was normal behavior and started documenting it like a slow-motion disaster. Revenge within the Angevin family was not explosive. It was methodical. If one son rebelled and failed, he waited. If a brother gained advantage, another undermined him quietly. Nobody forgot anything. Apologies were treated as temporary ceasefires at best. What makes this revenge story remarkable is how little anyone learned. Each generation repeated the same mistakes with confidence, convinced they would be the exception. They were not. Betrayal bred betrayal. Revenge produced more revenge, and the dynasty slowly consumed itself from the inside. Enemies outside the family barely had to intervene. They simply watched and waited. When the Angevins weakened themselves enough, rivals stepped in and claimed what was left. This is the medieval equivalent of leaving your door unlocked because you assume the house will collapse on its own. In the end, the Angevin revenge cycle did not elevate anyone. It did not restore honour. It simply ensured that no one enjoyed power for very long. The Angevins did not lose their dynasty to a single enemy. They lost it to each other. And that may be the most medieval revenge story of all. Scanderbeg's revenge story begins with one of history's most inconvenient childhoods. Taken hostage as a boy, raised by an empire that expected his loyalty, and trained to serve the very power that had crushed his homeland, Scanderbeg spent years smiling politely while filing away grievances like a man planning the longest to-do list in medieval history. To his captors, he was a success story. Educated, disciplined, loyal on the surface. The perfect example of how conquest could be made permanent. They trusted him. They promoted him. They assumed he had forgotten where he came from. He had not. Scanderbeg waited, and he waited properly. He learned how armies moved. He learned how commanders thought. He learned which rules were flexible and which were quietly ignored when convenient. Most importantly, he learned patience, the kind that only develops when revenge is impossible right now, but inevitable later. When the moment finally came, it arrived suddenly and politely. Scanderbeg defected, returned home, and reclaimed his ancestral lands with a speed that left everyone involved deeply embarrassed. Fortresses fell, alliances formed, a rebellion ignited that refused to burn out, no matter how many resources were thrown at it. This was not reckless revenge. This was revenge prepared with insider knowledge. Empire after empire assumed the rebellion would collapse. It did not. They assumed overwhelming force would solve the problem. It did not. Scanderbeg fought smarter, not louder. He avoided battles he could not win, struck where least expected, and made sure every victory was visible enough to inspire confidence and irritation in equal measure. The most insulting part for his enemies was how long it lasted. Decades. Years of campaigns, defeats, regrouping, and renewed resistance. Empires do not enjoy being delayed by one man and a determined population with very strong opinions about independence. Skanderbeg's revenge was not about destruction. It was about denial. He denied the empire peace. He denied them certainty. He denied them the satisfaction of finishing what they started. And he did it while outnumbered, outgunned, and relentlessly underestimated. This was revenge served slowly, deliberately, and with a deep understanding of human arrogance. The empire that took his childhood spent the rest of his life failing to take his homeland. Skanderbeg did not rush revenge. He lived inside it. And in medieval history, few revenges were as patient or as effective as that. Medieval revenge had many styles, but one of its favourites was hospitality. The Black Dinner of Scotland is proof that in the Middle Ages, accepting an invitation could be a fatal error, especially if the host smiled a little too politely. Two young noble brothers were invited to a feast under the promise of safety. This was not unusual. Feasts were meant to signal reconciliation, goodwill, and the temporary suspension of murderous intent. The boys arrived expecting food, conversation, and perhaps mild political manipulation. What they got instead was a lesson in medieval symbolism. Midway through the meal, servants entered carrying a black cloth and placed it on the table. In medieval culture, this was not subtle. This was not decorative. This was the equivalent of a handwritten note reading, "You are about to regret attending this dinner." The message was clear. The guests were arrested immediately. Accusations were read. Charges were invented with impressive speed. The boys were executed shortly afterward, having barely finished their meal. Dessert, regrettably, was cancelled. This was revenge masquerading as justice. Their family had grown too powerful, too influential, and too threatening to the ruling authority. Rather than fight them openly, which would have been messy and uncertain, the solution was to eliminate them quietly under the guise of lawful procedure. Medieval rulers adored this approach. It allowed them to claim moral high ground while actively committing betrayal. What makes the Black Dinner particularly chilling is its efficiency. There was no trial in any meaningful sense, no defense, no opportunity for escape. The entire event was designed to feel inevitable the moment the cloth touched the table. The political message was unmistakable. Trust was optional, power was not. This form of revenge didn't rely on rage or spectacle. It relied on ritual. The setting was calm. The tone was civil. The outcome was lethal. Medieval revenge often worked best when it pretended to be reasonable. The aftermath lingered for years. The families involved did not forget. Scotland did not forget. The event became a warning passed down through generations. When invited to dinner by someone who benefits from your absence, eat cautiously. The Black Dinner wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It didn't even require swords at the table. It simply reminded everyone that in medieval politics, revenge could arrive quietly, on a plate, while everyone was still pretending to be friends. Charles the Bold had a gift for making enemies. Not accidentally, deliberately, repeatedly. He believed intimidation was leadership, arrogance was strength, and that no one would ever coordinate long enough to stop him. Medieval history loves this type of man because it knows how the story ends. Charles ruled Burgundy with ambition bordering on obsession. He wanted expansion, glory, and recognition as a major European power. To achieve this, he humiliated rivals publicly, threatened allies privately, and dismissed warnings with the confidence of someone who had never been truly punished for bad behaviour. Naturally, people remembered. Rather than confronting Charles directly, his enemies did something far more dangerous. They waited. Swiss forces, rival nobles, and neighbouring powers quietly coordinated. Grievances piled up. Insults were catalogued. Each slight became another reason to cooperate. Charles, meanwhile, mistook silence for fear, a classic medieval error. When conflict finally came, it was not a heroic duel. It was a series of disasters. Charles underestimated terrain, overestimated loyalty, and assumed his reputation would carry him through battles that required actual planning. It did not. His armies suffered crushing defeats. Supplies failed, allies vanished, and when Charles himself fell in battle, his body was left unrecognized for days. A deeply symbolic ending for a man who had insisted everyone acknowledge his greatness. The revenge here was not delivered by one person, it was delivered by everyone Charles had offended. This was collective memory turning into action. No speeches, no declarations, just coordination fueled by long-standing resentment. What makes this revenge particularly medieval is its inevitability. Charles did not lose because he was unlucky. He lost because he had spent years creating the conditions for his own destruction. Every insult, every threat, every moment of arrogance returned with interest. His enemies did not need to exaggerate his flaws. They simply waited for him to face consequences. Charles the Bold did not die misunderstood. He died correctly assessed. In medieval Europe, reputation was everything. Charles built his on fear and intimidation. When that reputation failed to protect him, nothing remained. This was revenge without drama, revenge without mercy, revenge delivered by history itself. Not all medieval revenge involved blood, screaming, or inconveniently placed pikes. Some of the most devastating revenge was administrative, spiritual, and delivered with paperwork. The kind of revenge that ruins your life quietly, while everyone insists it is perfectly lawful. The Avignon papacy emerged after a series of humiliations inflicted on the papacy by secular rulers who decided that popes were useful, but only when obedient. Kings pressured, threatened, and occasionally kidnapped popes, treating spiritual authority like a mildly annoying department that needed restructuring. The papacy did not forget this. It simply waited. When the opportunity came, popes relocated to Avignon, conveniently aligning themselves with friendly monarchs and distancing themselves from hostile ones. This move was framed as practical, sensible, temporary. Medieval institutions loved pretending revenge was just logistics. From Avignon, the papacy began applying pressure the medieval way: excommunication, interdicts, and spiritual sanctions that turned entire kingdoms into religious no-go zones. Weddings stopped, burials halted, churches closed. The population panicked. Rulers suddenly discovered that annoying the Pope came with side effects. This was revenge at scale. Kings who had once bullied the papacy now found themselves negotiating, apologizing, or quietly undoing policies to regain favor. The papacy never raised an army. It didn't need to. It weaponized belief, tradition, and the very real fear of eternal consequences. What makes this revenge especially effective is how deniable it was. Popes could insist they were acting purely on spiritual principle. They were not angry, they were disappointed. Medieval rulers learned quickly that disappointment from the church was far worse than anger. The Avignon papacy wasn't about domination. It was about reminder. A reminder that while kings ruled bodies, the church ruled souls, and souls were significantly harder to replace. This revenge unfolded slowly, across years and borders. There was no single moment of victory, just a steady realization spreading through Europe that humiliating the papacy had been a catastrophic miscalculation. No swords were drawn, no castles were burned, but entire kingdoms were brought to their knees anyway. In medieval Europe, revenge didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered Latin phrases and waited for rulers to panic. By the time we reach the end of these stories, one uncomfortable truth becomes clear. Medieval revenge was rarely about emotion. It wasn't about losing control, shouting, or acting in the heat of the moment. That kind of revenge burned out quickly. Medieval revenge was colder, calculated, structured, and most importantly, patient. People did not seek revenge to feel better. They sought it to restore balance. Honor had been damaged, authority challenged, memory insulted. Revenge was the mechanism by which the medieval world corrected itself. often brutally, sometimes quietly, but always deliberately. This is why medieval revenge took so long. Years passed, decades passed, entire lifetimes passed. Grudges were not forgotten because forgetting meant accepting weakness. And weakness, in a world built on hierarchy, was dangerous. What makes these stories unsettling isn't their violence. Medieval Europe was always violent, but their restraint. Many of the most effective revenges came from waiting, watching, and allowing enemies to make mistakes on their own. Kings were not toppled in a fit of rage. They were dismantled through alliances, paperwork, symbolism, and timing. Sometimes the avenger didn't even live to see the outcome. Modern people often ask why medieval societies seemed so obsessed with revenge. The answer is simple. There were no reliable systems to guarantee justice. Courts were biased. Laws favoured the powerful. Mercy was unpredictable. Revenge filled the gap. And once revenge began, it rarely stopped at one person. Families inherited it. Kingdoms remembered it. Entire populations carried it forward like unfinished business. Forgiveness existed, but it was considered a luxury, something you could afford only when power was secure. The irony is that medieval revenge often succeeded. It removed tyrants, it humbled kings, it forced institutions to change, but it also created cycles that consumed generations, ensuring that no victory was ever clean or permanent. In the end, medieval revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about memory. People wanted to be remembered, as wronged, as justified, as avenged. And history, quietly and mercilessly, kept those records long after everyone involved was gone. So when we look back at these stories, we aren't just watching people settle scores. We're watching a world trying to impose order in the only way it knew how, not through forgiveness, but through consequences. And in medieval history, consequences had very long memories. Ludwig van Beethoven's life begins in the modest city of Bonn, in the year 1770, far from glittering salons or imperial courts. His childhood was not wrapped in encouragement or warmth, but in expectation, heavy, urgent, and often cruel. Music entered his life early, not as a joy, but as a duty. His father, Johann van Beethoven, was determined to mould his son into a prodigy, a public miracle that would lift the family out of mediocrity. Whether Ludwig wanted this role or not was irrelevant. The piano waited, the violin waited, and so did the long nights. Johann's teaching style relied more on fear than inspiration. Lessons stretched late into the evening. Errors were not corrected patiently. They were punished. Neighbours would later recall hearing a small boy crying while scales echoed through the walls. Yet even under this pressure, something extraordinary took root. Ludwig did not merely memorize music. He questioned it. He listened for structure, tension, and emotion long before he had words to describe them. Unlike other child performers, he was never fully comfortable on display. When pushed before audiences as a wonder child, he appeared awkward and intense, more focused on the keyboard than the room. Applause did not excite him. Silence afterward interested him more. From an early age, he seemed to sense that music was not about approval. It was about expression. Bonn itself played a quiet but crucial role. It was a small court city, but unusually open to Enlightenment ideas. Intellectual discussions floated through salons and taverns. Books circulated. Ideas mattered. Beethoven absorbed this atmosphere deeply. While still a teenager, he found mentors who recognized that his talent went beyond technical skill. They encouraged him to compose, not just perform, to create rather than imitate. By his early teens, Beethoven was already working as a court musician, supporting his family as his father's reliability declined. Responsibility arrived early. Childhood ended quickly. But this hardship forged independence, discipline, and a stubborn refusal to submit to limits, traits that would define his life. This was not the beginning of a polished genius. It was the origin of a fighter, a a boy shaped by pressure, sharpened by struggle, and already listening for a sound that existed beyond the notes on the page, a sound that belonged only to him. When Ludwig van Beethoven left Bonn for Vienna in the early 1790s, he was not arriving as a nobody, but neither was he a legend. Vienna was the musical capital of Europe, a city swollen with talent, ambition, and egos. Every street seemed to echo with symphonies, quartets, and reputations being built or destroyed. Beethoven arrived carrying recommendations, raw confidence, and a quiet certainty that he did not intend to fit in. At first, he did what was necessary. He studied with established masters, absorbed the formal rules of composition, and learned how the musical world functioned. On paper, he followed tradition. In practice, he tested its limits. Even as a young pianist, his playing startled audiences. He did not perform politely. He attacked the keyboard, stretching tempo, emphasizing contrasts, improvising with an intensity that felt almost confrontational. Listeners were not always sure whether they were witnessing brilliance or recklessness. Vienna quickly noticed him, not just as a composer, but as a force. Aristocrats invited him into their salons, not because he was charming, but because he was unforgettable. Beethoven had little patience for social niceties. He dressed carelessly. He spoke bluntly. He did not flatter patrons the way others did. Yet his talent was so undeniable that doors kept opening anyway. This combination of defiance and genius became his signature. Unlike many composers who wrote primarily to please employers, Beethoven treated music as something personal, almost moral. He believed it should say something about struggle, joy, rage, triumph. Early works still echoed the classical elegance of the era, but beneath the surface, something new was stirring. Rhythms grew bolder, dynamics more extreme, emotion more exposed. He was already pushing against the idea that music should remain restrained and balanced. At the piano, improvisation became his battlefield. He would challenge other musicians publicly, engaging in spontaneous musical duels that often left rivals humiliated. These performances built his reputation faster than printed compositions ever could. Word spread quickly. This man was dangerous, not physically, but artistically. By the end of his first years in Vienna, Beethoven had secured something rare. He was not merely accepted, he was anticipated. People wanted to hear what he would do next, partly because they sensed he might break something in the process. The city had given him opportunity. In return, Beethoven was preparing to reshape its musical future, whether Vienna was ready or not. At the height of his rising fame, when Vienna had begun to accept Ludwig van Beethoven as more than a curiosity, an unthinkable problem emerged. He began to lose his hearing. At first, it was subtle, a ringing that refused to leave, a dullness at the edges of sound. Beethoven tried to ignore it. He was young, successful. This was not how genius was supposed to unfold. But the symptoms worsened. Conversations became exhausting. High tones slipped away. Music, the very thing that defined him, began to fracture. For a composer whose identity was built on sound, this was not an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. Beethoven withdrew socially, often appearing irritable or aloof. In reality, he was terrified of being exposed. Deafness, in his world, was a professional death sentence. In 1802, he retreated to the village of Heiligenstadt, hoping rest would cure what doctors could not explain. There, alone and desperate, he confronted the truth he had avoided. His hearing was not returning. The isolation, the shame, and the fear crushed him. In a letter to his brothers, never sent but preserved, Beethoven confessed that he had considered ending his life. Music was the only thing that stopped him. He could not leave the world, he wrote, without saying everything he still had inside him. This moment marked a turning point. Instead of surrendering, Beethoven hardened. He accepted his condition, not calmly, but defiantly. If he could no longer hear as others did, he would compose as no one else dared. His music began to change, structures expanded, Emotional extremes intensified. Silence itself became meaningful. He was no longer writing to entertain. He was writing to survive. Paradoxically, as his hearing declined, his imagination grew louder. He no longer relied on sound as it existed in the room, but on sound as it existed in his mind. This internalization freed him. Music was no longer bound to polite expectation or physical limitation. It became personal, confrontational, and monumental. The Heiligenstadt crisis did not end Beethoven's career. It ignited it. From this point forward, every composition carried an undercurrent of resistance, against fate, against weakness, against silence itself. The tragedy did not soften him, it sharpened him. And from this struggle, a new kind of music was about to emerge. Music forged not from what he could hear, but from what he refused to lose. With his decision to live and compose on his own terms, Beethoven entered what scholars later called his heroic phase, though at the time it felt more like open rebellion. Classical music, as Vienna understood it, prized balance, elegance, and restraint. Beethoven respected these rules just enough to know exactly how to break them. His compositions grew larger, louder, and more emotionally exposed. Symphonies stretched beyond traditional limits. Movements became longer, more dramatic, and less predictable. Sudden silences interrupted storms of sound. Gentle themes were shattered by violence, then rebuilt stronger. Audiences were no longer being entertained. They were being challenged. The turning point came with works like the Third Symphony. What listeners expected to be polite background music instead arrived like a declaration. This was not music for salons. This was music that demanded attention, even confrontation. Some listeners were stunned, others were offended. A few understood that something irreversible had happened. Beethoven was no longer writing as a servant to tradition or aristocracy. He positioned himself as an independent artist, a radical idea at the time. He rejected permanent court appointments, choosing instead to live off commissions and patronage that did not dictate his voice. This freedom came at a cost. His finances were unstable, his personal life chaotic, but creatively he was untouchable. He was. As his hearing continued to deteriorate, his focus shifted further inward. He trusted his inner ear completely. Sketchbooks filled with obsessive revisions, tiny changes made and remade until the emotional weight felt right. Nothing was accidental. What sounded wild and spontaneous to listeners was actually the result of relentless control. Critics struggled to keep up. Some accused him of excess, of ugliness, of abandoning beauty altogether. Beethoven did not care. He believed beauty could include struggle, tension, even pain. Music to him was not decoration, it was truth. This period reshaped what composition could be. No longer confined to pleasing symmetry, music could now tell stories of conflict and triumph without words. Beethoven had cracked open the classical form and poured his inner life into it. And once that door was opened, it could never be closed again. The composer who once feared silence was now redefining sound itself. Not as something polite and ornamental, but as something human, flawed, and fiercely alive. As Beethoven's music grew bolder, his personal life narrowed. The man who filled concert halls with sound increasingly lived in silence and solitude. His hearing loss was no longer a secret to himself, but it remained something he fought to hide from others. Conversations were strained. Social gatherings became humiliating puzzles of misheard words and forced smiles. Slowly, deliberately, Beethoven withdrew. This isolation sharpened his temperament. He was famously difficult, suspicious of friends, hostile to servants, quick to anger. Yet beneath the outbursts was fear. Every social failure reminded him of what he was losing. He could command orchestras on paper, but struggled to order a meal without confusion. Pride kept him from admitting weakness. Loneliness became the price of independence. At the same time, his emotional life burned intensely. Beethoven longed for companionship and love. but his relationships were tangled and often doomed from the start. He fell repeatedly for women who were socially unavailable. Aristocrats he could admire, but never fully claim. Letters revealed deep tenderness, yearning, and frustration. One famous correspondence, addressed to an unnamed immortal beloved, exposes a man capable of profound devotion, yet unable to reconcile love with the demands of his art and his circumstances. Music became his refuge and his weapon. During these years, his compositions balanced fury and intimacy. Explosive passages clashed with moments of aching vulnerability. Piano sonatas, string quartets, and symphonies carried emotional contradictions that mirrored his inner life. He was no longer simply expressing struggle. He was living inside it. Financial instability added pressure. Though supported by patrons, payments were inconsistent, and Beethoven had little talent for managing money. He moved constantly, changing apartments in search of quiet or better conditions, often leaving chaos behind. His daily life was disordered, but his work remained obsessively controlled. On the page, everything had purpose. This period reveals a crucial truth about Beethoven. His genius was not separate from his suffering. It was shaped by it. The isolation did not silence him. It forced him inward, where his most personal music took form. He may have pushed people away, but he pulled humanity closer through sound. The world often remembers Beethoven as a monument, stern, heroic, untouchable. In reality, these years show a man raw with contradiction, desperate for connection, fiercely independent, wounded yet unyielding. And still, against silence, he continued to write. By the second decade of the 19th century, Beethoven crossed an invisible line. His hearing was no longer merely impaired, it was largely gone. Public performance became impossible. The composer who once dominated the piano with physical force now lived in near total silence. For most musicians, this would have ended everything. For Beethoven, it changed the nature of creation itself. He adapted in practical ways first. Conversation books replaced spoken dialogue, allowing visitors to write their questions while he replied aloud or in writing. He pressed his ear to the piano, feeling vibrations through bone and wood. But gradually, even these physical connections mattered less. Beethoven was no longer composing for the ear alone. He was composing from memory, structure, and inner necessity. Something remarkable happened during this period. As his connection to the external world faded, his music became freer than ever. Forms loosened, expectations dissolved. He no longer felt bound to audience reaction, because he could not hear it anyway. What remained was intention. Every note existed because it had to. The late works begin to reflect this transformation. They are strange, intimate, and sometimes unsettling. Melodies fragment and reform. Time stretches. Silence becomes active, almost expressive. These pieces do not explain themselves easily. They require patience. They ask the listener to meet the composer halfway. Contemporaries were often confused. Some thought Beethoven had lost control. Others whispered that deafness had damaged his judgment. But what they were witnessing was not decline. It was transcendence. Beethoven was no longer writing for courts, critics, or even performers. He was writing for something abstract and internal. Music had become thought. This phase also deepened the spiritual dimension of his work. Without religious dogma, Beethoven explored ideas of struggle, reconciliation, and unity. Sound became a language for meaning beyond words. Even joy, when it appeared, felt earned, wrestled from chaos rather than gifted. Isolation still weighed heavily on him, but it no longer defined him. He had crossed into a private territory where loss could not reach. Deafness had taken sound, but it had not taken music. In a paradox that still defies explanation, Beethoven was hearing more than ever. Not with his ears, but with his entire being. The world he inhabited grew smaller. The universe inside him grew vast, By the time Beethoven began shaping what would become his Ninth Symphony, he was living almost entirely apart from the world that once celebrated him. Deaf, isolated, and physically deteriorating, he nevertheless conceived a work unlike anything music had known before. This was not just another symphony. It was a summation of struggle, resistance, and a lifelong refusal to surrender. The idea of setting voices inside a symphony was radical. Instrumental music had long been considered a complete, self-contained form. To introduce human voices, and worse, a philosophical poem, risked ridicule. Beethoven did not care. He had been carrying Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy for decades, waiting for the right moment. Now, with nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose, he unleashed it. The Ninth Symphony does not arrive gently. It wrestles its way forward, built on tension and instability. Themes struggle to take shape, collapse, and try again. When the final movement begins, earlier ideas are rejected one by one, as if the music itself is searching for meaning. Only then does the human voice enter, not as decoration, but as necessity. The message is unmistakable. Joy is not naive happiness. It is something earned after suffering. Brotherhood is not automatic. It must be chosen. The symphony does not deny darkness. It passes through it. At the premiere in 1824, Beethoven stood on stage, conducting a performance he could not hear. When the music ended, he continued beating time, unaware that the orchestra had stopped. A singer gently turned him toward the audience so he could see the reaction. The hall erupted. Applause, tears, hats thrown into the air. Beethoven bowed, not to sound, but to sight. This moment has become legend, but it is more than sentimental. It reveals the core of Beethoven's achievement. He created one of the most powerful expressions of human unity ever written, while completely cut off from the very sense meant to receive it. The Ninth Symphony was not just a triumph of composition. It was a declaration. That meaning does not depend on circumstance, that joy can exist without comfort, and that art can outlive the body that creates it. Beethoven had reached a place beyond limitation. Silence had not defeated him. He had answered it, loudly, defiantly, and forever. After the thunder of the Ninth Symphony, Beethoven did not retreat into repetition or victory laps. Instead, he moved further inward, into territory that even his admirers struggled to follow. His final years produced music that feels detached from time itself, works that seem less concerned with performance than with exploration. The late string quartets and piano sonatas baffled audiences. They were quieter, stranger, and structurally unpredictable. Melodies wandered, rhythms stretched or dissolved. Sudden bursts of humour appeared beside passages of aching simplicity. These pieces did not explain themselves. They invited contemplation, not applause. Beethoven was no longer interested in impressing anyone. He wrote as if communicating with something beyond listeners, perhaps with himself, perhaps with the future. Technical difficulty increased, but virtuosity was no longer the point. Expression was. A single phrase might carry more weight than an entire earlier movement. Physically, his health was collapsing. Illness, liver failure, and constant pain plagued him. His living conditions deteriorated. He argued with doctors, ignored advice, and endured treatments that often worsened his condition. Yet even as his body failed, his creative clarity sharpened. Music remained precise, intentional, necessary. These late works often reflect a deep acceptance, not resignation, but understanding. Struggle still appears, but it is quieter now, less combative. There is space for humour, tenderness, and peace. Some movements feel almost conversational, as if Beethoven were thinking aloud on paper. Many contemporaries dismissed this music as incomprehensible. Performers hesitated. Critics questioned his sanity. Beethoven himself was unbothered. When told that audiences did not understand his quartets, he reportedly replied that they were not written for the present age. He was thinking ahead. Today, these late works are regarded as some of the most profound music ever composed. They speak across centuries, resisting simple interpretation. They do not demand admiration. They demand listening. In these final compositions, Beethoven achieved something rare. He created art that feels personal without being confessional, complex without being showy, and spiritual without doctrine. The man who once shattered musical forms now dissolved them entirely. This was not the end of his voice. It was its most distilled expression, quiet, fearless, and infinitely human. In the spring of 1827, Ludwig van Beethoven was dying. His body, worn down by years of illness, pain, and neglect, was finally giving way. The man who had wrestled fate through sound now lay confined to a bed, surrounded by chaos even at the end. Unpaid debts, scattered manuscripts, unfinished plans. Silence, the great adversary of his life, was complete. On March 26th, a violent storm swept over Vienna. Thunder cracked the sky, rain lashed the city. According to those present, Beethoven stirred as the storm reached its peak. He raised a clenched fist, as if defying the heavens one last time. And then he was gone. He was 56 years old. Vienna did not respond quietly. Thousands attended his funeral. Composers, poets, aristocrats, and ordinary citizens filled the streets. For a man who had spent his final years isolated and misunderstood, the farewell was overwhelming. The city finally grasped what it had witnessed. Not just a composer, but a turning point in human expression. Beethoven left no simple legacy. He did not offer comfort in the easy sense. His music does not exist to soothe without challenge. Instead, it insists that struggle is not a flaw in the human experience. It is the core of it. He expanded what music could say and who it could speak for. No longer merely entertainment or ornament, music became confession, philosophy, resistance. Most remarkably, Beethoven achieved this while losing the very sense meant to define him. He proved that creativity is not dependent on circumstance, talent alone, or physical ability. It is an act of will, an act of defiance, an act of belief. Long after his death, his works continued to shape the world. Romantic composers found permission to be personal. Modern artists found courage to break form. Even today, his music appears at moments of triumph, mourning, revolution, and unity. It survives because it speaks honestly about pain, hope, fury, and joy. Beethoven once wrote that music should strike fire from the heart of man. He did exactly that. Even in silence, even in death, his sound never ended. The age of cathedrals begins not with stone, but with longing. In the early Middle Ages, Europe was emerging from centuries of instability. Towns were growing again. Trade routes reopened. Markets filled with voices. And with this quiet recovery came a powerful desire to give shape to faith in a way that could be seen, felt, and endured. The low, heavy Romanesque churches of the past suddenly felt insufficient. They were safe, solid, and dark. But they did not soar. Medieval people did not imagine God as distant. The divine was everywhere, active and watching. A cathedral was meant to reflect that reality. It was not just a building for prayer. It was a statement carved into the earth. Height mattered, light mattered, space mattered. The higher the vaults climbed, the closer heaven seemed. The more light that entered, the more divine truth was believed to flow inside. This was also an age of competition, not between individuals, but between cities. A cathedral announced wealth, stability, and spiritual importance. If one town raised higher walls or brighter windows, its rival felt compelled to answer. Bishops, guilds, kings, and ordinary townspeople all contributed. These projects took generations. A child born at the laying of the foundation would likely die before the roof was finished. And yet people gave anyway, stone by stone, coin by coin, labour by labour. Unlike castles, cathedrals were not built to exclude. They were open to everyone. Peasants, merchants, nobles, all entered the same space and looked upward together. For many, this was the grandest structure they would ever see. The building itself taught theology without words. Height spoke of God's power. Order spoke of divine reason. Light spoke of salvation. In cities like Notre Dame de Paris and Chartres Cathedral, this ambition crystallized into something new. Builders began to imagine churches that were no longer heavy and earthbound, but vertical and luminous. The goal was no longer merely to endure, it was to ascend. The age of cathedrals was born from this shared impulse, to turn faith into architecture, stone into prayer, and human effort into a visible reach toward heaven. The true beginning of the Gothic cathedral does not happen all at once. It ignites in a single place, under a single vision. Just north of Paris, at the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis, a quiet architectural revolution took shape in the mid-12th century. The driving force behind it was not a master mason, but a monk, Abbot Suger. Suger was not interested in novelty for its own sake. He believed that light was a direct reflection of the divine. To him, brightness was not decoration, it was theology. If God was perfect clarity, then a church filled with light could elevate the soul simply by existing. Darkness, once seen as solemn and protective, now felt like a barrier between humanity and heaven. To achieve this vision, builders at Saint-Denis began experimenting. Thick, Romanesque walls were no longer enough. They needed to open the structure without causing it to collapse. The solution came through a series of innovations that worked together like parts of a single system. The pointed arch redistributed weight more efficiently than the old rounded form. Ribbed vaults channeled pressure along defined paths. Walls could finally be pierced, thinned, and transformed into frames for glass rather than solid barriers. This was not a sudden leap of genius, but a careful balance of daring and calculation. Every decision risked disaster. Stone ceilings were unforgiving teachers. If the math was wrong, the building would fail, sometimes decades after construction began. Yet the reward was extraordinary. Sunlight flooded the interior, filtered through coloured glass that turned illumination into narrative. At Saint-Denis, this light was not random. Stained glass windows told stories to a largely illiterate population. Saints, kings, martyrs, and biblical scenes unfolded in colour. Light became instruction. Beauty became belief. What emerged was something entirely new. The building no longer felt heavy. It felt alive. Space stretched upward. Columns dissolved into lines rather than masses. The structure seemed less like stone resisting gravity and more like stone cooperating with it. The success of Saint-Denis sent shockwaves through medieval Europe. Builders saw what was possible. Patrons saw what was prestigious. Cities saw a future carved in light. Gothic architecture had found its language, and it was about to spread, higher and brighter than anyone had imagined. As Gothic cathedrals reached higher and brighter, a problem became impossible to ignore. Stone is heavy. Vaults push outward as much as they press down. The taller the building, the stronger those sideways forces became. Without a solution, walls would buckle, windows would shatter, and heaven-reaching ambition would collapse back to earth. The answer was as radical as it was visible: the flying buttress. Instead of hiding structural support inside thick walls, Gothic builders moved it outside. Arched stone arms leapt from the upper walls and landed on massive exterior piers. These buttresses absorbed and redirected the force of the vaults, carrying weight safely down to the ground. What had once required solid, windowless walls could now be achieved with openness and height. This was more than an engineering fix. It transformed the appearance of cathedrals entirely. The building became a visible system, its skeleton displayed rather than concealed. To medieval eyes, this was not ugly or mechanical. It was honest. Structure itself became part of the beauty. Flying buttresses allowed walls to dissolve into glass. Windows expanded dramatically. Interiors flooded with light. The building no longer felt like a fortress defending the sacred. It felt like a framework holding light in place. Nowhere is this more clearly expressed than at Notre Dame de Paris, where the flying buttresses form a ring of stone arms around the nave. They are both practical and poetic, stone reaching outward so the building can rise inward. These supports also changed how cathedrals were built. Construction became modular. Walls, vaults, and buttresses were designed as parts of a single system. Builders could push height further than ever before, confident that weight had somewhere to go. From the outside, Gothic cathedrals began to resemble stone forests. Vertical lines, branching supports, rhythmic repetition. From the inside, they felt almost weightless. This contrast was deliberate. The labour, complexity, and danger of construction were kept at the margins, while worshippers stood inside a space that suggested effortlessness. The flying buttress made the impossible practical. It turned stone into something that could appear to defy gravity. And once builders understood that weight could be carried outward, not inward, the age of cathedrals entered its most daring phase. With walls relieved of their burden by flying buttresses, Gothic builders turned to what would become the soul of the cathedral: stained glass. These were not decorations added after construction. They were the reason the building existed in this form at all. Stone was now a frame. Light was the message. Medieval theology understood light as divine presence made visible. God was truth. God was clarity. To be bathed in light was to be closer to heaven. Stained glass transformed this idea into architecture. Sunlight entered not as harsh brightness, but filtered, coloured, and intentional. Reds burned, blues cooled, golds shimmered. The interior of a cathedral became a moving tapestry that changed with the hour, the season, and the weather. For most people, these windows were not art objects. They were books. Literacy was rare, but images spoke fluently. Biblical stories unfolded panel by panel. Saints suffered, kings knelt, martyrs bled, and miracles occurred in coloured light. Even complex theology could be conveyed through symbol and sequence. The cathedral taught simply by existing. Nowhere is this clearer than at Chartres Cathedral. Its windows survive in astonishing number and intensity, especially the deep cobalt blue that seems almost unreal. Standing inside, the world outside dissolves. The light does not illuminate the space so much as inhabit it. The stone feels secondary. The building seems made of colour held in place. Rose windows pushed this idea even further. Perfect circles of glass radiated outward like cosmic diagrams, combining geometry, theology, and light into a single form. They represented order in the universe, divine reason expressed through symmetry. When sunlight struck them directly, the effect was overwhelming. Heaven, briefly, appeared structured and knowable. This emphasis on light changed how people experienced worship. The cathedral was no longer a dark shelter against the world. It was a transformation of it. Ordinary sunlight became sacred. Time itself was marked by shifting colour rather than bells alone. In the age of cathedrals, light was not passive. It preached, it instructed, it moved. Stone had learned to glow, and in doing so, Gothic architecture achieved its most powerful illusion, that heaven was not far away, but pouring in through glass. Gothic cathedrals were designed to be read by the body before the mind. The moment a person stepped inside, the architecture guided their gaze upward. Columns rose in uninterrupted lines. Arches sharpened into points. Vaults soared overhead like stone canopies. Everything in the space worked together to make height feel inevitable. This verticality was not accidental or merely impressive. It was theological. Medieval thinkers believed the universe was ordered, hierarchical, and ascending toward God. The cathedral mirrored that belief in stone. Earth was below, heaven was above. The building became a diagram of existence itself. Pointed arches played a crucial role. Unlike rounded Romanesque arches, they directed weight downward more efficiently, allowing for taller structures. but their visual effect mattered just as much. They suggested movement, aspiration, a sense that the building itself was stretching upward rather than sitting passively on the ground. Ribbed vaults reinforced this feeling. Their intersecting lines created a skeletal pattern overhead, drawing the eye along paths that converged high above. The ceiling was no longer a heavy lid. It was a network of lines leading upward, encouraging contemplation beyond the physical space. This emphasis on height changed how worshippers experienced scale. Individuals felt small, but not insignificant. The vastness of the space placed human life within a larger order. To stand beneath such height was to feel both humbled and included. You were part of something structured, meaningful, and vast. Verticality also served a social purpose. Cathedrals dominated city skylines. Long before towers or modern monuments, these buildings announced identity from miles away. A traveller approaching a town would see the cathedral first, rising above houses and walls like a spiritual beacon. The city existed beneath it. Faith crowned the landscape. Yet this height was not only about dominance, it was about direction. The cathedral did not push people outward or inward, it pulled them upward. Even those uninterested in theology could not ignore the physical sensation. The architecture demanded a response. By turning height into meaning, Gothic builders transformed stone into instruction. The cathedral taught without words: look up, think upward, live upward. In the age of cathedrals, heaven was not only promised, it was physically implied, carved into every arch and column that climbed toward the sky. A Gothic cathedral was never the work of a single generation. It was a project that outlived its planners, its builders, and often even its original vision. Construction could stretch across decades, sometimes centuries, turning the cathedral into a living process rather than a finished object. When the first stones were laid, no one expected to see the end. That was understood. Faith, after all, was not short-term. The cathedral belonged as much to the future as to the present. Bishops might change. Kings might fall. Wars might interrupt work for years. But the building waited. Stone is patient. These projects mobilized entire cities. Masons, carpenters, glassmakers, blacksmiths, sculptors and labourers all played roles. Guilds took pride in contributing. Donors funded chapels, windows or altars in exchange for prayers and remembrance. Even the poor gave what they could: a coin, a day of labour, a cart of stone. The cathedral was not imposed on the city. It was grown from it. Construction sites were chaotic, dangerous places. Cranes powered by human treadmills lifted enormous blocks. Scaffolding climbed higher each year. Accidents were common. There were no modern blueprints, only experience, geometry, and trust. Master masons carried knowledge in their heads and hands, passing it down through apprenticeships rather than books. Because projects lasted so long, styles evolved mid-construction. A nave might begin in one Gothic mode and finish in another. New techniques replaced old ones. Towers were redesigned, plans adapted to ambition, disaster, or opportunity. The result was architecture that recorded time itself, layers of intention stacked in stone. Cathedrals also shaped urban life. Streets bent around them, markets gathered nearby, pilgrims arrived, bringing wealth and ideas. The building became the city's anchor, both spiritually and economically. In places like Amiens Cathedral, scale alone announced confidence. This was not a town planning to fade quietly. It was a city declaring permanence. What mattered most was continuity. Each generation accepted responsibility from the last. They did not ask whether the project was practical. They asked whether it was worthy. In an age with little certainty, the cathedral offered something rare, a promise that human effort could reach beyond a single lifetime. The age of cathedrals was built slowly, deliberately, and collectively. One stone at a time, laid for people who had not yet been born. If light was the soul of the Gothic cathedral, sculpture was its voice. Long before anyone stepped inside, the building was already speaking. Portals, facades, towers, and roofs were crowded with figures carved in stone. Saints, kings, prophets, monsters, angels, and sinners, all arranged to tell a story to anyone who approached. The main entrance of a cathedral functioned like a sermon carved into rock. Figures lined the doorways in rigid vertical rows, elongated to echo the architecture itself. They did not smile casually or strike natural poses. They stood solemn, timeless, and watchful. These were not portraits of real people, but ideals made visible. Wisdom, authority, judgment, mercy, all given form. At places like Chartres Cathedral, the West Portal presents an entire theology before a single step is taken inside. Christ appears in glory. Apostles flank him. The order of heaven is laid out clearly. To enter the cathedral was to pass through doctrine, moving from the imperfect world into sacred space. But not all sculpture was solemn. High above the streets, grotesques and gargoyles crouched along ledges and gutters. These strange figures served practical purposes, channeling rainwater away from walls. But they also carried symbolic weight. They represented chaos, sin, and the dangers outside the sacred boundary. Inside was order and light. Outside lurked disorder. This contrast was deliberate. The cathedral was not meant to deny the existence of fear or evil. It acknowledged them openly, then placed them at the margins. Monsters stayed on the roof. Saints guarded the door. Meaning was built into placement as much as form. Sculpture also humanized the building. Faces began to show emotion. Figures interacted. Over time, stiffness softened. Drapery flowed more naturally. Stone bodies gained weight and presence. Gothic sculpture slowly rediscovered humanity without losing symbolism. The divine became relatable, not distant. For medieval people, this imagery was not optional decoration. It was instruction. Most worshippers would never read scripture, but they could read stone. The cathedral explained the world visually, who ruled it, who judged it, and where one stood within it. In the age of cathedrals, stone did not remain silent. It warned, taught, comforted, and accused. Long before a priest spoke, the building itself had already delivered its message. What began in northern France did not remain there for long. The Gothic cathedral proved too powerful, too persuasive to stay confined to one region. Its language of height, light, and structure spread across Europe, carried by travelling masons, ambitious bishops, and cities eager to proclaim their importance. Yet as Gothic travelled, it adapted. The idea remained the same. The expression changed. In France, Gothic emphasized unity and clarity. Cathedrals were conceived as coherent systems, every element aligned toward vertical ascent and luminous interiors. Elsewhere, local traditions reshaped the style. In England, Gothic stretched horizontally rather than vertically. Long naves, complex rib patterns, and an emphasis on linear rhythm created spaces that felt expansive and processional rather than overwhelming. The building invited movement rather than awe alone. In the German lands, ambition turned monumental. At Cologne Cathedral, height became obsession. Towers rose to extreme proportions, pushing Gothic logic to its limits. Construction stretched across centuries, interrupted and resumed by different eras that all remained faithful to the original medieval vision. The result was not just a cathedral, but a statement of endurance. Further south, Gothic encountered different light and materials. In Italy, classical tradition never fully loosened its grip. Cathedrals like Milan Cathedral adopted Gothic structure, but multiplied decoration. Spires crowded the roofline. Marble replaced darker stone. The effect was less about inner glow and more about external spectacle, a forest of stone reaching skyward. Despite these differences, the core message survived. Gothic architecture everywhere aimed to transcend the ordinary. It organized space to guide emotion. It used engineering not just to stand, but to persuade. Whether elongated, monumental, or ornate, the cathedral remained the central symbol of civic and spiritual life. This spread also reveals something important about medieval Europe. It was not isolated or static. Ideas travelled, skills migrated. Innovation crossed borders long before modern nations existed. The cathedral became a shared language, one that allowed different cultures to express the same aspiration in their own accents. By the late Middle Ages, Gothic dominated the skyline of Europe. No other architectural style had unified so much territory with such consistency of purpose. Stone after stone, city after city, the age of cathedrals had become continental, a shared effort to build meaning into space itself. By the late Middle Ages, the great age of cathedral building began to slow. Wars drained treasuries. Plagues shattered populations. New artistic ideals emerged that favoured balance, proportion, and classical restraint over vertical intensity. The Renaissance did not destroy Gothic cathedrals. It simply stopped building them. The upward race paused, yet the cathedrals remained. Long after scaffolding vanished and masons died, these buildings continued to shape the world around them. They outlived the cities that built them, the kings who funded them, and the bishops who consecrated them. Stone endured where power did not. The true legacy of the age of cathedrals is not technical, though the engineering was revolutionary. It is psychological. These buildings changed how humans understood space. They proved that architecture could move people emotionally, not just shelter them. That stone could teach, persuade, and inspire without a single spoken word. Even stripped of belief, the experience remains. To stand beneath a Gothic vault is still to feel small, directed, and attentive. The building does not ask what you believe. It asks you to look. Upward, inward, slowly. Places like Notre Dame de Paris remind us that cathedrals were never finished ideas. Fires, restorations, revolutions, and neglect altered them, but did not erase them. Each generation left marks, some careful, some careless. The buildings absorbed it all. Time became part of the structure. In a world increasingly built for speed and utility, Gothic cathedrals stand as monuments to patience. They represent a culture willing to invest centuries into a single vision, knowing the reward would be inherited, not enjoyed. That mindset is as foreign today as the theology that inspired it. The age of cathedrals was not just about faith reaching heaven. It was about humanity reaching beyond itself, beyond lifespan, beyond certainty, beyond immediate reward. These buildings are frozen ambition, solid hope, organized longing. When sunlight passes through stained glass and spills across ancient stone, it still completes the original intention. For a moment, the distance between earth and heaven feels smaller, and in that moment, the medieval builders succeed again, long after they are gone. Before gods had names, before giants cast shadows, before time learned how to move forward, there was Ginnungagap. It was not a place you could stand in, nor a thing you could touch. It was the great in-between, a vast, yawning void where nothing yet had shape, but everything waited to become. To the far north lay Niflheim, a realm of cold so deep it felt eternal. Its rivers flowed thick with ice, mist clung to everything, and silence ruled without mercy. To the far south burned Muspelheim, a world of fire and raw heat, where flame was alive and destruction was constant. These two realms were opposites, locked in endless tension, separated only by Ginnungagap itself. At first, nothing stirred, but the void was not empty. Cold crept outward from Niflheim. Heat pushed upward from Muspelheim. Slowly, inevitably, they met. When frost from the north collided with the warmth from the south, the ice began to melt. Drops formed. From those drops came movement. From movement came life. Not gentle or beautiful, but vast and terrifying. From the melting ice of Ginnungagap emerged Ymir, the first giant. He was not born with intention or care. He simply happened. Existence did not begin with order, but with collision. Alongside Ymir came the cosmic cow, Audhumla. From her flowed nourishment, milk that fed the giant and sustained the first life. She, in turn, licked the salty ice blocks, slowly revealing another being hidden within them. Over time, a form took shape. A god was uncovered, not created. Buri, the ancestor of the gods to come. From the very beginning, Norse creation was not clean or harmonious. It was accidental, violent, and unstable. Life arose from extremes clashing, not from careful design. The universe was born from imbalance. Ginnungagap remained at the centre of it all, the silent witness, the space that allowed opposites to meet. It was neither good nor evil. It simply allowed becoming. This origin tells us something essential about the Norse worldview. The cosmos was never safe. Order was never guaranteed. Creation itself was fragile, born from forces that could just as easily destroy it. In the Norse beginning, existence did not start with light or wisdom. It started with cold, fire, and a vast silence that finally broke. From the melting ice of Ginnungagap came Ymir, the first being, vast, ancient, and uncontrollable. He was not shaped by purpose or guided by wisdom. He existed because the cold and the fire had collided, and that collision demanded consequence. Ymir embodied the raw, untamed nature of the early cosmos. He slept, and from his sleeping body more life emerged. As Ymir dreamed, giants were born from him. From the sweat beneath his arms came a man and a woman. From his legs came another being. Life multiplied without intention, spreading outward in strange and uneven ways. This was the first age of existence, and it belonged entirely to the giants. They were not evil in the moral sense. They were simply enormous forces of nature, driven by appetite, instinct, and survival. The giants did not build. They did not create order. They endured. They filled the universe with their presence, heavy and ancient, like mountains that walk and breathe. The cosmos at this stage had no structure, no balance, and no mercy. It was alive, but it was not yet meaningful. While Ymir slept and giants multiplied, Audhumla continued her slow, patient work. She licked the ice blocks left behind by the frozen rivers of Niflheim. Each day, more of what lay hidden beneath the ice was revealed. First hair, then a head, then a full body. From the ice emerged Buri, not born but uncovered. Buri was different. Where Ymir was vast and chaotic, Buri was defined, shaped, intentional. He did not belong to the giants, nor did he oppose them. Not yet. He represented something new entering the universe. Lineage, continuity, and the potential for order. Buri fathered a son, Bor, who in turn would father 3 sons of his own. These sons would become the gods, not creators in the absolute sense, but shapers. The universe already existed. Their task would be to give it form. At this stage, however, the giants still ruled. The cosmos was unbalanced, dominated by Ymir's endless, uncontrolled expansion. Life existed, but it crowded itself, pressed against itself, threatened to collapse under its own weight. This tension could not last forever. In the Norse imagination, creation is not peaceful. It is a struggle. And the struggle was coming. The age of giants set the stage. What followed would be an act of violence so fundamental that it would transform chaos into a world. The universe could not remain as it was. Ymir's presence was too vast, his offspring too numerous, his chaos too heavy for anything else to grow. In the Norse imagination, creation does not arrive gently. Order is not negotiated into existence. It is carved out through force. Bor's 3 sons, Odin, Vili, and Ve, looked upon the world and saw imbalance. The giants multiplied endlessly, while meaning itself had no space to take root. If anything new was to exist, something old had to end, and so the gods did the unthinkable. They turned on Ymir. The slaying of Ymir was not a battle in the heroic sense. It was a cosmic act. When Ymir fell, his blood poured out in such volume that it drowned nearly all the giants. Only a few survived, escaping into the outer edges of existence. With that flood, the age of uncontrolled growth ended, but the gods did not destroy Ymir simply to remove him. They used him. From Ymir's body the world was shaped. His flesh became the earth. His blood became the seas and oceans. His bones rose into mountains. His teeth and broken fragments formed rocks and stones. From his skull the gods fashioned the sky, lifting it above the earth and setting it in place. Sparks taken from the fires of Muspelheim were scattered across it, becoming stars. Even the chaos was given purpose. The gods placed 4 dwarves at the corners of the sky to hold it aloft, turning destruction into structure. The world was no longer an accident. It had direction. From Ymir's eyebrows, the gods created Midgard, a protective enclosure for humanity yet to come. This was not kindness without caution. The giants still existed beyond its borders, and Midgard was meant to shield fragile life from forces older and stronger than itself. This moment defines the Norse view of existence. Creation is not pure. It is built from sacrifice. Life stands on death. Order rests on violence. The universe is not morally clean. It is functional. The gods did not erase chaos. They contained it, and they knew it could return. With Ymir's death, the cosmos finally took shape, not as a paradise, but as a contested space, balanced for now, held together by force, intention, and constant tension. The world had been made, but it was not yet complete. With Ymir's body transformed into earth, sea, and sky, the gods had given the cosmos structure, but structure alone was not enough. A world without order is only a corpse of creation. Odin, Vili, and Ve now turned to the task of shaping realms within the vastness they had made, dividing existence into distinct worlds, each with its own nature and purpose. At the centre lay Midgard, the world made from Ymir's eyebrows. It was enclosed, protected, and fragile. This was not the heart of the cosmos, because it was powerful, but because it was vulnerable. Midgard was designed as a place where life could exist without being crushed by older, greater forces. It was a world that needed boundaries to survive. Above Midgard rose Asgard, the realm of the gods. It was not placed there by accident. Height meant distance, authority, and separation. Asgard was connected to Midgard by Bifrost, the burning bridge of shifting colour. This bridge was not open to all. It marked the division between divine and mortal, between those who shaped fate and those who lived inside it. Beyond these worlds lay others, each born from the same raw materials, but bent to different purposes. Jotunheim became the land of the giants, vast, wild, and untamed. It was not destroyed because chaos could never be fully erased. It had to exist somewhere. Niflheim and Muspelheim remained at the edges of creation, cold and fire anchoring the cosmos in the same extremes that had begun it all. At the centre of everything stood Yggdrasil, the great world tree. It did not grow from soil alone, but from the structure of existence itself. Its roots reached into different realms. Its branches held the worlds together. Life, fate, gods, giants, and mortals were all bound to it. The cosmos was no longer a collection of places. It was a living system. The gods did not create a peaceful universe. They created a balanced one. Each world existed in tension with the others. Fire threatened ice. Giants threatened gods. Gods feared fate. Nothing was permanent. Nothing was safe. This is the quiet truth beneath Norse creation. Order exists, but it must be maintained. Structure is real, but it can break. The gods themselves were not outside this system. They were bound by it. With the worlds shaped and held together, the universe could finally sustain life with meaning. But the most fragile creation was yet to come. With the worlds shaped and held together by Yggdrasil, existence still lacked one crucial element: rhythm. Space had been formed, but time had not yet learned how to move. The cosmos stood assembled, but motionless, like a great hall with no footsteps, no seasons, no passing of days. For life to truly exist, it needed cycles. The gods turned their attention to the sky. From the sparks taken earlier from Muspelheim and scattered across the heavens, Odin and his brothers now imposed order. What had once been drifting embers became fixed lights. Stars took their places. Directions gained meaning. The sky was no longer a lid held aloft. It became a map. Then came the shaping of day and night. From the giants emerged two figures tied to motion and light. Night and her son, Day. Night rode first, dark and heavy, casting shadow across the worlds. Day followed, bright and swift, bringing warmth and visibility. The gods set them on paths through the sky, ensuring that neither could dominate forever. Darkness would always return, but so would light. The sun and moon were placed into motion as well, drawn across the heavens in eternal flight. They were not free. In the Norse vision, even celestial bodies are chased by destruction. Wolves pursued them relentlessly, snapping at their heels, reminding all beings that time itself is hunted. The sky was not peaceful. It was active, threatened, alive. With these movements, time began. Days could pass. Seasons could change. Growth and decay became possible. The universe was no longer frozen in a single moment of creation. It could age. This is essential to understanding the Norse worldview. Time is not a gift. It is a condition filled with pressure. Everything that exists is moving toward an end, even as it continues forward. The sun shines, but it is chased. The moon glows, but it will one day be caught. By giving the cosmos rhythm, the gods accepted inevitability. Cycles meant repetition, but also exhaustion. Birth implied death. Motion implied collapse. Yet without time, nothing fragile could survive. Plants could not grow. Beings could not change. Meaning could not accumulate. With night and day set in motion, the worlds were no longer just shaped. They were alive. And now, within this moving universe, the gods were ready to create something that would walk inside time itself. With the world set in motion and time flowing through them, the gods turned their attention to something smaller and more fragile than mountains or stars. They walked along the shore where sea met land, where driftwood lay scattered, shaped by waves, worn smooth by time, but lifeless. There, Odin, Vili, and Ve found two trees. One was an ash, the other an elm. They were rooted, silent, and unmoving. Part of the world, but not yet alive within it. The gods did not carve them into servants or weapons. Instead, they chose to make something new. Beings who would live inside the world, not above it. Odin stepped forward first and gave them breath. Not just air in the lungs, but the force that animates, the spark that separates living from still. With that breath came spirit and awareness. Vili followed and gave them movement and will. He granted them the ability to act, to choose, to step forward rather than remain where they were placed. Thought and intention entered them. They were no longer shaped only by the world. They could shape themselves. Ve completed the act. He gave them sight, speech, and form, faces to recognize one another, voices to name things, bodies that could feel pain, warmth, hunger, and comfort. With this final gift, the trees became people. They were called Ask and Embla, the first man and the first woman. They were not made from divine substance or cosmic fire, but from wood, from the same material as the world itself. Humans, in Norse thought, were not distant from nature. They were nature, awakened. The gods placed Ask and Embla within Midgard, behind the protective boundary made from Ymir's brows. This was not paradise. It was shelter. Humans were not meant to dominate the cosmos, nor to escape it. They were meant to survive within it. Unlike the gods, humans were not immortal. Unlike giants, they were not vast. They were temporary, vulnerable, and deeply affected by time. But they possessed something rare, consciousness shaped by limitation. This origin matters. Humans were not created to rule the world, nor to serve the gods blindly. They were created to live, to endure cold and hunger, to build, to remember, to tell stories in a universe that would one day forget them. From trees came people. From people came history, and with that, the Norse cosmos gained witnesses. With humans now walking in Midgard, the cosmos gained observers, but it was still ruled by forces beyond choice. Beneath the branches of Yggdrasil, deeper than gods or giants, lay something older and more absolute. Fate. At the roots of the great tree lived the Norns, 3 ancient beings who shaped destiny itself. They were not gods, and they did not answer to gods. They existed before worship and beyond prayer. Their names were Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld. What was, what is becoming, and what must be. Each day, the Norns drew water from the well of Urd and poured it over Yggdrasil's roots, keeping the world tree alive. This was not an act of kindness. It was maintenance. The cosmos required care to continue, but even that care could not change its end. The Norns carved fate into wood and stone. They set the lifespan of humans, the fortunes of kings, and even the doom of the gods themselves. No being escaped their reach. Not Odin. Not Thor. Not the smallest mortal born into Midgard. This is one of the most unsettling truths of the Norse creation myth. Free will exists, but within limits. Choices matter, but outcomes are shaped by forces that cannot be negotiated with. Courage is meaningful precisely because it cannot prevent death. Honor matters because it does not guarantee victory. Humans lived under this knowledge. Life was brief. Winters were harsh. Survival was uncertain. But meaning did not come from safety. It came from action taken in full awareness of risk. To live well was not to avoid fate, but to face it without turning away. Even the gods understood this. Odin sacrificed an eye for knowledge, not to escape fate, but to understand it. He knew how the story would end. He chose to walk forward anyway. This worldview shaped everything. Heroes were admired not because they lived long, but because they acted rightly in short time. Cowardice was worse than death. Memory was stronger than survival. With fate woven beneath the roots of existence, the Norse cosmos gained gravity. Creation was no longer just a beginning. It was a trajectory. Everything moved forward, not toward peace, but toward a known ending. And yet, life continued. Gods ruled, humans built, giants waited. The world endured, balanced on a tree whose roots drank destiny itself. But fate does not remain quiet forever, and the final cycle was already waiting. From the moment creation settled into balance, its ending was already written. The Norse cosmos was never imagined as eternal. It was built with the knowledge that it would one day break. Every world, every god, every human life existed on borrowed time. The giants still lived beyond Midgard, nursing old resentments. Fire still burned in Muspelheim. Ice still waited in Niflheim. Chaos was not destroyed, only restrained. And restraint, in the Norse vision, is always temporary. Signs of the future were woven into the present. Monsters were born alongside gods. Fenrir grew too strong to be trusted. Jormungandr circled the world, biting its own tail. Hel ruled over the dead, her realm filling quietly with souls. These were not accidents. They were consequences. Creation carried its own shadow. Even Yggdrasil suffered. Though it held the worlds together, it was constantly under attack. Creatures gnawed at its roots. Rot crept inward. The tree lived, but it was never secure. Existence required constant endurance. What makes this worldview remarkable is its honesty. The Norse did not imagine a universe rescued by progress or moral improvement. There would be no final harmony, no perfect resolution. The end would come through collapse, not redemption. Yet this knowledge did not lead to despair. It shaped a different kind of courage. Knowing that the world would fall gave meaning to what happened before it did. Loyalty mattered because betrayal was possible. Love mattered because loss was certain. Acts were measured not by outcome, but by intent. The gods themselves embodied this tension. They built halls, made laws, protected humans, and fought chaos, all while knowing it would eventually overwhelm them. Their greatness lay not in winning forever, but in resisting anyway. This is the final lesson embedded in Norse creation. Existence is valuable not because it lasts, but because it happens at all. A world that ends is not meaningless. It is fragile and therefore precious. Therefore, the cosmos stood, fully formed now. 9 worlds held together by a wounded tree, governed by gods who knew their doom, inhabited by humans who lived briefly, but remembered fiercely. Creation was complete. Only one chapter remained, not of beginning, but of return. In the Norse imagination, creation does not move in a straight line. It curves. It bends back toward its beginning. The same forces that shaped the world will one day unmake it, returning everything to a familiar state, not peace, but silence. Ragnarok waits at the horizon of time, not as a punishment and not as a mistake, but as a fulfillment. Fire will rise again from Muspelheim. Ice will break loose from Niflheim. Giants will cross boundaries long held. Gods will fall, not because they were weak, but because the structure they built was never meant to be permanent. Yggdrasil will tremble. The sky will split. The sea will surge over the land it once circled. Order will collapse back into motion. The cosmos will remember what it was before shape, before law, before names. And yet, this is where the Norse story refuses to end in nothingness. After the destruction, something remains. The fire does not burn forever. The flood recedes. The earth rises again from the sea, green and renewed. Not all gods perish. Not all life is erased. A new world emerges, quieter, cleaner, shaped by memory rather than ignorance. Humans survive as well. 2 figures, hidden and protected, step into the renewed world. Just as Ask and Embla once emerged from wood, humanity begins again, not as conquerors, but as inheritors. They live under the same sky, on the same earth, but with the weight of what came before them. This return is not a reset, it is a continuation. The universe does not forget its suffering, it carries it forward. The next world is not promised to be safer or kinder, only possible. And beyond it all, silence returns. Not the empty void of Ginnungagap exactly, but something close to it. A stillness that holds potential rather than absence. The same quiet that once allowed fire and ice to meet now waits again, patient and indifferent. This is the full arc of Norse creation. Not a story of eternal victory, but of recurring becoming. Life rises, structure forms, meaning is made, and when it all falls apart, something endures, not perfection, but possibility. In the Norse world, existence is an act of defiance against nothingness, repeated endlessly. Creation begins in silence, ends in silence, and between those silences, life burns brightly, because it knows it will not last. And that, perhaps, is why it matters.